"Honey, have you ever thought about getting married?" I asked. I was watching her prepare a tossed salad in her apartment the day before I had to leave. The knife she was using kicked against the side of the sink and made a harsh, clattering sound as it rattled around in the bottom. She turned around to stare at me with her eyes wide. She was clutching her hands against her stomach, and I was afraid she'd cut herself. I got up and stepped quickly across the kitchen. Taking her by the wrist, I turned her hand over and examined it carefully, but I didn't find even a slight nick. "Sorry," I said. "I thought you might have cut something." "I nearly did," she remarked. Some color was coming back into her face, and I sat back on the stool at the breakfast bar. "Well, have you?" I asked. She leaned back against the counter and looked at me wonderingly. "Have you?" she answered, except that it wasn't really an answer. I nodded anyway. "Yeah, I have," I said, "but I don't know how you feel about it. Sometimes I think you prefer what we have now, the independence and stuff, you know?" "What else?" she demanded. "Well, there are those times that I wonder if the way we live now doesn't suit you best. We see each other for a few days each month and we have an incredible time, but you live here in Sacramento and I live in Denver. I wonder if it's not one of those absence makes the heart grow fonder kind of things. Getting married would be a heck of a step, and I wonder if you would want me around, underfoot all the time, as it were." I'd rehearsed almost all these words. I truly had been thinking about our situation for a long while. I think I surprised Karen. We'd become comfortable with each other and hadn't found any reason for disagreement in a while now. "No," she said. "It's not that at all, hon." She hesitated, then came to me and wound her arms around my neck. She kissed me long and hard. "Ronnie," she said slowly, when we came up for air, "the reason I haven't brought this up is a little different from what you think." She took a deep breath, not backing away an inch. Her arms were still wrapped around my neck, though a little looser. "I love you, Ron, that's no secret, and I know you love me too," she said softly. "The only thing wrong is that you hold back something of yourself from me, and I don't think you even know you're doing it. If it weren't for that, darling, I'd quit my job in a heartbeat and come to live with you for the rest of my life." I was astonished. What was it I was holding back from her? We talked for hours. I never did get a handle on what she thought I was holding back. It had something to do with a belief that I hadn't yet closed the book on Sherry, that I still loved Sherry and hadn't worked her out of my system. I thought that, if anything, I might still be harboring a lot of pin-up anger and hostility towards Sherry. To me, that sounded more like what I was feeling than anything else. I got a little impatient with Karen. I didn't believe there were any good feelings left for my ex-wife, and I told Karen so. She was adamant, though, and wouldn't budge on the idea. We ended the discussion after dinner, refusing to let it devolve into a full-blown argument. If you're enjoying my content, consider joining my Patreon community. By becoming a patron, you'll get access to full parts of my videos much earlier than everyone else. Plus, you'll be supporting me to create even more awesome content for you. Check out the link in the description to join now. Neither of us wanted to do that with only 24 hours before I left for Afghanistan. Life was too short. Later that night, we made love in her bed and bathroom, and then back again twice. We finally lay exhausted in each other's arms. "Ronnie," she said just before we both fell asleep, "let's both of us think hard about our future while you're gone. Okay? Then, when you come back, we'll go away somewhere by ourselves for a long time and we'll work it out. Okay, darling?" "Okay, it's a date," I said softly. She didn't say anything more. After a while, she turned away from me and backed up until we were spooning. My arms were wrapped close around her. We slept hard, woke up early and made love again, and then I had to go. When I got back to Denver, I had about 6 hours before the flight to JFK Airport in New York. From there, I'd take a series of flights heading east to Europe and then to the Asian continent, gradually working my way to Kabul. There weren't that many airlines flying into that war-torn country, and the corporation had a policy of requiring its employees to use American flag air carriers whenever possible. It made the routing a little more difficult and more circuitous than it otherwise would have been. After doing a load of clothes and packing everything I could imagine needing in Afghanistan, I still had 2 hours left with not much to do before going to the airport. Mulling over the near argument with Karen, I hunted through the back of my closet until I found the box containing all the papers, court motions, and other material left over from my divorce. In the bottom, hidden by a mass of paperwork, was the packet of photographs I had snapped of my wife and that other man. Beside them was the small ring box that held Sherry's engagement and wedding rings. She'd sent her rings back to me through her attorney the day after our divorce had become final. I thought they were her property. After all, I'd given them to her, but I guess returning them to me was her way of getting some finality to the marriage. I looked at the photographs one by one, finding them to be distasteful, but I couldn't summon up any deep resentment or anger anymore. It was like the pictures were of two strangers instead of one stranger and one loved one. As such, they were just examples of low-grade PRN. It occurred to me I didn't want these left behind just in case I died over in Afghanistan and someone had to go through my personal things. Impulsively, I pushed everything else back into the box and closed it, leaving out the pics. Then I put the photos through my shredder. In a few moments, they were unintelligible bits of glossy, colorful paper, and I thought no more about them. Afghanistan in late winter is abominable. It's always bitterly cold or snowy or windy. Actually, it was usually all three at once. It was seldom that all three of the weather patterns ease up and give us a nice day. On top of that, this northeastern sector of the country was incredibly barren and bleak to my eyes. I had no clue why anyone would want to live here, but Afghanistan is one of the longest inhabited countries on the face of the planet. I could only shake my head. The days were long, the work hard and dangerous even without the threat of Al-Qaeda or Taliban terrorist attacks. Working with heavy equipment is dangerous in its own right, but we built a pretty good safety program and rigorously enforced the rules. For defense against the bad guys, we had a platoon of Marines under the command of a young lieutenant to defend us, but they couldn't be everywhere. I didn't like the naked feeling of being unable to protect myself and my crew. After I'd been there a month, I coaxed the senior sergeant in the platoon into giving me an M4, the carbine version of the M16. Its real owner had gone back home on emergency leave and hadn't come back. It was still on the Marine Company books. It was just that I was taking care of it for them. I felt a lot better with it around. I was a passable shot with it. I always had a knack with weapons. With my Remington Model 700 at home, I could knock down a deer at 200 yards and more every time I fired it. Well, anyway, the M4 felt comfortable in my hands. By the third month of my stay, we had the bridge virtually rebuilt. New foundations were poured where they needed to be and replacements filled in the places where the blast had blown girders away. At the same time, we'd worked out a resupply plan for the crew still building the road north, using helicopters to ferry in supplies and materials needed urgently. For other equipment, supplies, and vehicles, we bulldozed a dirt road around the gorge and through empty terrain. It worked, after a fashion. We could get to the head of the road, but it took a lot of time, and the crew up there had to make supply requests a long way in advance. Actually, things were improving every day. The contract looked secure. The road would be finished on or before schedule, and the Department of the Army had even awarded us another small contract that looked very lucrative. We were working hard, but there wasn't much else to do in the empty wasteland, so we routinely worked 14 hours a day, or more, just to have something to do. Melissa's diary. When we heard Ron was going to Afghanistan, I almost died. Ron was as close to me as a brother, and I was worried sick about him. When I told Sherry, her face turned white as a sheet. She nearly collapsed. It surprised me a little. She and Ron have been divorced right at 3 years now and had lived apart for even longer. What with the separation after he left her and all. It's been so long since I had a minute free to add anything to this diary. If I repeat some things, I guess I'll just have to delete them when I look at this thing when I'm old and gray. Huh? Well, let's see, where was I? Okay, a while back, I had to try and get Sherry to lighten up on herself again. For the longest time, she went back to beating herself up pretty bad about having caused so much grief, and it was hurting her health. She went through a second round of counseling, and it finally began kicking in. She got over the worst of her depression as she and the counselor explored what she did and what she could do to make things better. She's done pretty well ever since. When I told her about Ron's trip overseas, though, it threw her for a loop. It wasn't until we started getting regular emails from him that she settled down again. The emails were widely spaced because they didn't have real good communications over there, but they came through often enough to keep us from being worried too much. He said it was hard work and stuff like that, but also pretty boring. There wasn't much to do except work. On the other hand, he said that he'd worked off the love handles he'd been getting worried about, and he was probably in the best physical condition of his life. A photo he attached to one of his emails showed us he was right. Sherry made me blow it up to an 8 by 10 and print it for her. She also kept a couple of 5 by 7 prints. It was about that time that I noticed Sherry wasn't dating. Not at all. When I asked around, I felt like a fool. She hadn't dated since she and Ron broke up, and I never noticed. Isn't that terrible? My best friend and I didn't know. Well, anyway, Cal and I started taking her out every so often with us to dinner and stuff like that, and sometimes to Fisher's for some dancing. Sherry would dance fast dances with some of the guys, but she was awfully picky even then. Most of the men got turned down flat, and some went away red-faced from whatever she said if they persisted. My Cal says Sherry has a real good command of the English language when she wants to use it. He said it like he admired her for it. I guess that tells me what kind of language she commanded, huh? Well, I figured out Sherry would only dance slow dances with Cal and a few older married men she'd found she could trust. On top of that, she wouldn't have anything but a little white wine when she went with us, and only a couple of glasses lasted the whole night. It didn't take a genius to see that she was saving herself for something, and one day, I got her to talking about it. It took isolating her in my backyard back under the pecan tree and making her real comfortable with a lot of good food and a couple of hours talking about nothing in particular. Finally, she let down her hair a little and said she had this feeling that Ron was going to come back to town someday. When he did, she said, he was going to see she wasn't fooling around with anyone, and maybe he would forgive her for what she did back then. If it took the rest of her life, she said, she'd wait for him to see how she changed, and then she'd deal with whatever came next. She didn't really have more than a slim hope they'd get back together, she said. In fact, she assumed they would not. It was like this whole thing was some kind of penance, and she was just serving time until Ron released her from it by coming home and agreed she had changed. Sherry didn't know when he would come back. She just figured he would. I told her I could think of a couple of surefire ways to get him to come home. She wouldn't have any of that, though. She was adamant she wasn't going to use any coercion, though. I told her that sounded like she was setting herself up for a long, dreary life, but she just shook her head and smiled knowingly at me. He was going to come back to town someday. She just knew it. I gave up talking to her about it. I even tried to introduce her to some nice guys from Cal's work, but she never would go out with them. I'm not real pleased with this whole mess, but she seems to be okay with it. She is just not going to date anyone at all. I had to accept it and let the discussion drop. I didn't have to like it, though. Sherry filled out again after getting her mind around most everything in the second series of counseling sessions. She'd lost a lot of weight with the worry and self-recriminations and stuff, but now she's gained most of it back and she looks really great. I hate her. Even after having 3 kids of my own, my chests aren't anywhere near as big as hers. It's not fair. The woman seems to be more focused and happier than at any time since her divorce. She's a volunteer with the local PDA and works hard on the Neighborhood Watch program too, of all things. Huh? Her life seems to be fun again. I guess her 2 roommates help keep her from getting too down in the dumps. Heck, they smile all the time, and I guess that would have to give her a boost just about all the time. Huh? Oh, and Sherry's doing good at work too. She had taken a job at a new accounting firm not too long after the divorce and has been promoted 3 times in the little bit less than 3 years she's worked for them. She has 16 auditors and financial analysts working for her now, and it looks like she's in line for a better job when the old fart screwing it up finally retires. She loves her work. She's been coming over for barbecues for a long time now whenever Cal and I have one, and she's just fantastic with the kids. She's like part of our extended family. Our oldest boy is 5 now. His birthday was last week. My 3-year-old, Cal Jr., is just like a son to her, and my 14-month-old girl follows Sherry around everywhere she goes. It's cute to watch my baby walk a few steps towards Sherry, stand still when she feels her balance going, and then plop down on her bottom. Then she gets on all 4s and crawls so fast. She giggles like a maniac when she finally catches up to Sherry. All 3 of my kids just love her to death. Ron should be emailing us again any day now. It's been about a week, and he tries to send Cal and me something every week or 10 days. I show them all to Sherry. She hounds me for the latest one if I haven't forwarded it on to her right away. I wonder what Ron would say if he knew.